Britain's Foreign Secretary called for a constructive and robust relationship with China. James Cleverley accused Beijing of the biggest peacetime military buildup in history, but he also rejected the idea that China should be isolated, comments which have angered members of his own Conservative Party who want a hard line. So what exactly is Britain's stance on China? Welcome to the programme. I'm Philip Hampsheir. When David Cameron was leader just 8 years ago, Britain declared an era of golden relations with China. Last year, the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, declared that over. Ties have been soured by claims of espionage, accusations against Huawei, and the crackdown in Hong Kong. But Foreign Secretary James Cleverley has been more circumspect, admitting in his keynote speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet that no significant global problem can be solved without China. He even plans to meet senior Chinese officials at the coronation celebrations. So where does Britain actually stand on the China question? I'm joined on the programme today in the studio by Norman Baker, who's a former UK Home Office Minister. In Hong Kong, we have Andrew Leung, who is an independent expert on China. And in Shanghai, Miguel Geraci, who is Professor at the University of Nottingham, China, and former Under-Secretary of State for Commerce in the Italian government. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. Norman, I'm going to start with you because you're here with me in the studio. In his speech, James Cleverley said at the Mansion House meeting that he had, "I'm often asked to express our policy towards China in a single phrase or in a single word, whether that word is threat or partner or adversary." Are any of those applicable, do you think? Complicated, I would imagine, was probably a better word.
I think all three are applicable in different circumstances. And I thought the speech he gave was actually quite measured. I thought he paid tribute to China's rule in the world and its history, which is impressive, but also recognised the hard reality where they clash with British culture in particular over issues to do with human rights and democracy. And indeed, I think the balance was good in his speech, but whether that was a view shared by the regime in China appears to be in some doubt.
Andrew, let me pass this across to you. James Cleverley's speech, when he gave it, what was the response in China, in your opinion? Did they take this as a measured and given diplomatic speech, or did they regard it as a little bit of an attack?
Well, I think that his speech must be compared with the earlier rhetoric by the British Prime Minister, Sunak, who appeared to be much more anti-Beijing, anti-China than the Foreign Secretary's Mansion House speech is made up to be. Well, I listened to the speech. It is quite a balanced speech in a way, but it hides certain misconceptions and also a kind of sentiments painting China as if China is a devilish country, even without using the word. There are still a great deal of misrepresentation and misunderstanding of key issues in relationship, in relation to Hong Kong, for example, where I am, in relation to Xinjiang, in relation to the South China Sea, and indeed in relation to the governance of the Chinese nation, as if China is a devilish country treating its people badly. Well, the reality is far from the case. If you look at what the Harvard Kennedy School recent research out a couple of months ago, comparing how people around the world regard their governments, is a very detailed study by the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center, and it found that the Chinese Communist Party government is best supported by its people, multiple ranks above a lot of democracies, including the United States, because the lives of the Chinese people have been totally transformed, miraculously transformed during the past 40 years under the tutelage of the Chinese Communist Party. And secondly, if you look at also similar studies by the Elderman, EDELMAN research center based in New York, out about last month or 2 months ago, similar findings. And what is more recently, the research center in Paris, Ipsos, IPSOS, it found that the Chinese people is amongst the happiest people in the world because, again, a high degree of security, high degree of stability, and very, very positive outlook on the future. So again, China, even though a different ideology, has been very successful. And I think the speech failed to take that into account.
Andrew, a superb answer there. Let me bring in Michele, though. Michele, do you agree with all of that?
The speech was good at the beginning because I think the minister recognized that you cannot define China with a single word. I would go even further to I say this to my government in Italy and when I came to other governments in Europe, I don't know why there is this urge for governments in Europe to find words to define the relationship with China. I think it's a chase that is mostly aimed at gather electoral consensus rather than being of any practical use. That's similar to what the European Union does. It writes white papers calling China a systemic rival, competitors, and there is all this waste of money and time and effort in trying to find words instead of doing things, words that really, to be honest, no one cares about. I do think, however, that at the end of the speech, he fell into the usual, let's say, Western rhetoric. I think you mentioned it, Philip, about common values, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. Now, these things of values, we need to be clear because it's a very interesting and important topic. And we need to decide, do we only trade with other partners that share exactly the same values that we have? If the answer is yes, I fear that many European countries would not even trade with each other. Even within countries, you would have cities that would not trade with other cities. So I think this value thing is again used as an excuse. And then two final points. China has a lot of problems, a lot of things that needs to fix. Equal access, level playing field for Western companies, intellectual property right, and so on. These are the things we need to insist on, not Hong Kong
Michele,
or Xinjiang. Because
let me just pause you there because we're going to come on to that in a second, and I want to give Norman here a moment to come back. And Michele makes the point quite validly that we have to decide, are we trading with people because we agree with their values, or are we just trading with people and that's trade? No, so what's your place on that?
Well, we're trading with people because that's trade, and I don't think the Foreign Secretary, to be fair to him, suggested otherwise. Of course we have to trade with China. Of course we trade with anybody. It'd be ludicrous not to, unless there is a United Nations resolution which has been passed to ban a particular trade arrangement. But can I come back to Andrew? Because there is a difference between China government and China people. And I think it's very important to make the point that people over here in this country, and the Foreign Secretary, who's not my party, by the way, we don't ever run down China as a country. We criticise the Chinese government in the same way as, for example, we don't run down the Israeli state. We run down the Israeli government, what they do. We separate between the government and the people. But I mean, and of course, the Foreign Secretary made an acknowledgement of China's economic development, which has been fantastic.
800 million people lifted out of poverty over
absolutely.
25 years.
No one can doubt that's been a substantial achievement. But part of the downside, which Andrew, I think, didn't recognise the fact that the Chinese government has signed documents which it then fails to uphold, such as the agreement to respect the status of Hong Kong for 50 years from 1997 onwards. The Chinese government has signed lots of bits of paper. It doesn't hold to what it's signed.
Andrew, I'm going to come across to you on that, if I can. What do you think of the comments that have been made by various European governments and, of course, have been referenced by the British Conservative government about, yes, they want to do more trade with China, and yes, they're happy to do trade with China, but, of course, they do keep bringing up subjects that China might regard as internal affairs?
If you talk about the situation in Hong Kong, for example, I mean, Hong Kong has been doing extremely well and is returning from chaos. to vitality after the enactment of the national security law. Because after 3 years of disruption and holding law and order to ransom, Hong Kong is now returning to normalcy. And of course, Hong Kong is still a vibrant common law jurisdiction, very different from the rest of China. So I think that there was a great deal of misunderstanding about Hong Kong. Now, as far as the Xinjiang is concerned, of course, don't forget, the Xinjiang used to be a hotbed for separatism, fueled by the Eastern Turkestan independence movement. And all these after the countermeasures, the situation is under control. But Xinjiang is, of course, is an extremely important province for China, not just for the resources, but also as a passage for the Belt and Road connecting Central Asia. Now, as for the Taiwan, of course, Taiwan is under the One China policy, but on the other hand, the United States seems to be just paying lip service to this policy and trying to create more and more diplomatic space for Taiwan, as if Taiwan was a separate country. But of course, China's preference, as stated clearly in 3 white papers published, the last one immediately after the Nancy Pelosi visit, all stressing the preference for peaceful unification. As in the case of Hong Kong, indeed. Hong Kong, of course, was ceded to Britain. The Hong Kong island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. And of course, Lady Margaret Thatcher, in the beginning, didn't want to return Hong Kong. But look what happened. Hong Kong returned to China peacefully. And that's what China prefers, as in the case of Taiwan.
Thank you. Michele, I'm going to play a piece of the speech, if I can. This is something that James Cleverley actually said on the evening.
It would be clear and easy and perhaps even satisfying for me to declare some kind of new Cold War and say that our goal is to isolate China. It would be clear, it would be easy, it would be satisfying, and it would be wrong. Because it would be a betrayal of our national interest and a willful misunderstanding of the modern world.
Now, slightly interestingly, immediately after that, the Chinese government rushed out a statement of their own with reference to exactly that comment. This is from Mao Ning, who's in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. She's a spokesperson there, and she had this to say.
China urges the British side to be careful in words and deeds, stop making groundless accusations against China and interfering in China's internal affairs.
Miguel, that's a pretty polite way of the Chinese government to say mind your own business, isn't it?
It is. That's really what China has been saying for several decades, and more so now. Basically, for China, interfering in its own domestic affairs is a red line. This is for many reasons. One is political, of course, but the other one is also cultural. To discuss things in public, in the public debate, if there are problems, normally these are addressed behind closed doors. You know, you never see Xi Jinping coming to Europe and say to Macron, so what is happening with the migrant from Calais to Dover, or what Prime Minister Sunak is doing with Northern Ireland, or with me in Italy, what we're doing with migrants from Africa. They don't do that. They don't interfere. They don't tell the US what they're doing with their own problems, domestic violence, war, and so on. So it is when we use the principle of symmetry that we probably understand better why China feels a little bit, pushed when we do comment on things that are internal issues like Hong Kong, like Taiwan, like Xinjiang. The way they treat their own people for China is their own business, just like the way we in Italy treat our own people is our own business. And people have had a revolution and a civil war in China to choose the government that they have now. So it's not been imposed by forces outside. It's what the Chinese people have decided to have since 1949. And so for China, all these three, let's say, hot potatoes that we always bring up are kind of internal issues, and it's for them it is not good that we raise them. And in fact, it is of no help even to those people. Like if we want to maybe raise issue with some rights in Hong Kong, a smooth solution of the Taiwan, for example, the example of the island of Hong Kong that was given for free without the need to do so by Margaret Thatcher to Deng Xiaoping, is samples of peaceful solutions instead of sending warships around the Taiwan Straits. And if I may, two things. The fact that it's Britain to issue warnings about Hong Kong, which of course was a colony, not the biggest democracy for 150 years. Of course, it sounds weird to the ears of Chinese people who say, yes, maybe we accelerated the process and the Sino-Joint Declaration, we did something that maybe was not as we had promised in 1984, but you guys have stolen our land for 150 years. Same when the US talks about the Xinjiang and the labor force. I've been to Xinjiang many times. I've seen no evidence of labor force. But it's weird that we discuss about cotton fields, labor camps. When they reply, the Chinese, they say, listen, guys, this is not Alabama. You can have, as I said before, a whole host of problems that China could solve, but they don't like the British to talk about Hong Kong and the American to talk about cotton fields, because these are two things, it's almost mockery. That's how they, in China, perceive Britain and the US raising those 2 points, where those two countries actually have something maybe to be forgiven about.
Norman, here's where the friction is, isn't it? Europe keeps going across, and in this particular case, we're talking about the United Kingdom, making comments about the situation in China. A lot of people want the British government to come down and perhaps present a harder line on any one of these contentious issues. And the Chinese look at it and they go, well, look, when we were last in Britain, we didn't talk about Belfast.
Well, they're welcome to talk about Belfast if they want to talk about Belfast. And I want to come on to this phrase, internal matters, which I think has been used, because Tibet was an independent country with an independent government, its own foreign policy. It signed treaties with Britain, to which China was not party, its own currency, its own stamps, every single aspect of an independent country. It was illegally annexed by the Chinese government in 1959. So that's not an internal matter, that's an annexation of another country. Secondly, in terms of Hong Kong, there was an international agreement reached between China and Britain from 1984 onwards, which set out the terms of how Hong Kong will be governed in the next 50 years from 1997 onwards. That was broken. It wasn't adhered to by the Chinese government. Thirdly, as far as Taiwan's concerned, Taiwan clearly doesn't want to be part of mainland China. That's, in my view, their right. It's a matter of self-determination. We had in this country, Scotland wanted to go independent from the rest of the country. There was a referendum. It so happened Scotland voted to stay. But if Scotland had voted to leave, it would have left. Why doesn't Taiwan get its own choice as to whether it's part of China or not? Why should I have this one-China policy imposed upon them? They might want to do something else.
Now, you were a minister in the Home Office.
Yes.
So you came face to face with these discontinuities between those political realities and then the fact that there is a trade picture. Britain does an enormous amount of trade with China, and that trade has only been rapidly rising over the course of the last 30 years.
I'm in favour of the trade with China.
So how do you deal with those two discontinuities when every time you bring up one of the other subjects, China says, well, mind your own business, it's got nothing to do with you?
Well, because you don't have to always have a trade consequence for a discussion about human rights, or a human rights consequence for a discussion about trade. You know, I went to Beijing when I was a minister, actually, when I was Minister of Transport, as a matter of fact, to sign an agreement with the Chinese Transport Minister. It didn't stop me raising matters about Tibet, but on the other hand, there was a deal to be done on transport, which I did with them.
May I jump in?
Michael, go on then.
I think, Norman, I think you have a good point, but it must be very clear, and you may talk directly to Sunak. If Britain thinks that Tibet, Taiwan should be independent, then Britain should open a direct relationship and recognize the independence of Taiwan and Tibet very simply. So all problems solved. If you think that's the reality of things, rather than saying, oh, it was invaded, but not. If you think Tibet should be independent and Taiwan should also be independent, then Britain can unilaterally declare and open up embassies of Tibet and Taiwan in London. Very easy.
It's not for us to say they should be independent. It's for us to say, I think, that they should be able to self-determine their future and their own status. That's what I think. If they want to be part of China, that's fine. If they don't, they should be allowed to go off. That's where we are.
Norman, you know that the right of self-determination of people has been imposed with weapons and borders. Even after the World War has never been, people in only a handful of countries really vote and choose the government.
Well, let me take this across to Andrew. Andrew, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think that as far as self-determination is concerned, talk that to Spain, for example, in Catalonia.
I agree.
And for the United Kingdom, well, what about Ireland?
I agree.
Scotland. I mean, are you going to hold a referendum on that, or allow the Scottish people to hold a referendum?
Yes.
So I think that national security national sovereignty is a very, very sensitive issue. Now, as for Taiwan is concerned, as I said, the preference is for peaceful unification. And in fact, there is over 1 million Taiwanese people with their members of the family working and living in China, together with many enterprising entrepreneurs. And then there are many Taiwan tourists visiting the mainland and vice versa. So I think that the chances are that there is a momentum, possible momentum towards peaceful unification. So this kind of rhetoric that China is going to invade Taiwan anytime soon is a great deal of warmongering.
Andrew, when we're talking about warmongering, we do have to bring up China has gone through a very rapid process of military spending increases over the course of the last 15 years. It was one of the things that James Cleverley mentioned quite heavily in his speech. The UK, for instance, the entire Royal Navy is 74 ships. It's a little bit unfair to point out that China now has 742 ships in its navy. A lot of those are a good deal smaller than the UK's aircraft carriers. But nonetheless, there's a tenfold increase in the number of ships relative to the Royal Navy. China has been expending a large amount of money on its military, and you can understand why that might make other countries nervous, can't you, Andrew?
Well, you've got to understand why is China doing that. If you look at China's eastern seaboard, it is surrounded by the first island chain with American military assets centered in Okinawa, the second island chain centered in Guam, together with some of America's allies, now more recently, the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal with Australia. And so China's eastern seaboard is almost totally encircled by hostile forces. And of course, the eastern seaboard is extremely important for China because through this passes through China's lifeblood, international trade and essential commodities. And in addition to the two island chains, let's not forget the Malacca Strait choke point controlled by the American 7th Fleet. So if you were China, you feel threatened. And actually China's building a blue water navy, not with the intention of invading any other country, but to defend its economic lifeblood, which underpins its survival.
Michael,
so I think that you've got to look at that from that perspective.
Andrew, so my apologies for cutting you off there, but we're running out of time. Michael, I'm going to quickly let you get last word in. What do you think of China's rapid militarization and the fact that it seems to make a lot of other countries very nervous?
I understand why neighboring country may be worried, but we also have to look at the history of China that really has not been belligerent, invading other countries, not dropping bombs for the last 50 years. And therefore, also China's intention to build the Belt and Road that tries to mitigate a little bit the reliance on sea and therefore move to land transport. Now, when we look at the numbers, I was talking a few days ago to someone who pointed out the Chinese number of military bases abroad has increased by almost 70%. And then I said, but 70, what do you mean? There were 3 and now there are 5. So we need to look at the proportion in proportion to the actual size, without lowering the alert. That I agree, China does it for defensive, not to attack or conquer other countries. There is really no logic why China would invade neighboring countries.
Now, Michele makes that point, Norman. Of course, not everyone feels the same. If you were in the Philippines or in Brunei or in Thailand and you were looking at some of the South China Sea islands or the Spratly chains, there are a lot of people who are nervous about China's military buildup.
China is not going to invade Japan. China is not going to invade the Philippines. China is going to claim as much as possible the South China Sea in contradiction to rulings in the United Nations about who owns which bit of that particular sea. And it's going to potentially, at some point, at least people in the West think, will invade Taiwan. And I think if the Chinese government is entirely defensive, what it should do now is to come out with a clear statement that it will never invade Taiwan. And if it wants Taiwan back, it will only do so if Taiwan agrees itself to be part of China. If it gives that assurance, then a lot of the concern will go away.
Norman, Michele, Andrew, absolute pleasure to have all three of you on the show. Fascinating subject. Remember, you can find more fascinating subjects and discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.